On the morning of September 11, 2001, the World Trade Center was the target of a terrible attack. On this fateful day that would change the world forever, several commercial airplanes that had been hijacked by members of the terrorist group Al-Qaeda were intentionally crashed into different targets on American soil, with the Twin Towers being the main target, causing the deaths of thousands of Americans and the destruction of both buildings. The 21st century had begun, and it brought with it a new era of geopolitical conflicts. However, as the years passed, many doubts began to arise surrounding the alleged attack and its consequences. But what is the dark truth behind this fateful event? The World Trade Center was not conceived as just any real estate project. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey promoted it in the early 1960s as part of a plan to revitalize Lower Manhattan, which was then in commercial decline. The commission went to architect Minoru Yamasaki, who proposed two identical 110-story towers, then the tallest in the world, surpassing even the Empire State Building. Construction required the removal of 1.2 million cubic meters of earth and rock, and a containment method called the bathtub, a perimeter concrete wall that made it possible to excavate below the level of the Hudson River without water flooding the site. That same containment structure, 60 meters below the surface, would remain intact after the collapse of both towers almost 30 years later, preventing the area's underground train system from flooding. The towers opened progressively between 1970 and 1973, and, despite their fame, were never an immediate financial success. For much of that decade, New York's office market suffered from oversupply, and it was only in the 1980s and 1990s that the complex became established as the headquarters of banks, insurance companies, and international financial firms. By 2001, about 430 companies occupied its offices, with nearly 50,000 people working there every day. The complex had already been the target of an attack before. On February 26, 1993, a truck bomb containing more than 600 kilograms of explosives detonated in the underground parking garage of the North Tower, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000 in a failed attempt to bring one tower down against the other. The attack, carried out by a group linked to Ramzi Youssef, the nephew of the man who would later become the operational architect of September 11th, provided lessons that the Port Authority partially implemented. Photoluminescent signs were installed in the stairwells, and evacuation plans were strengthened, measures that in 2001 made it possible to bring thousands of people out alive from the lower floors in the first minutes after each impact. September 11th, 2001, began as a clear Tuesday on the east coast of the United States. At 7:59, American Airlines Flight 11 took off from Boston bound for Los Angeles with 92 people on board. At 8:14, 5 men armed with knives took control of the cockpit. Minutes later, the airplane's transponder was turned off and the flight disappeared from conventional radar screens. At 8:46, Flight 11 crashed into the north face of the World Trade Center's North Tower between floors 93 and 99. The impact penetrated several levels and started a fire fueled by the jet fuel, about 38,000 liters of kerosene. 17 minutes later, at 9:03, United Airlines Flight 175, also hijacked, struck the South Tower between floors 77 and 85. This time, millions of people watched it live on television, because the cameras were already pointed toward the smoke from the first tower. That was the moment when the world understood that it was not an accident. At 9:37, a third airplane, American Airlines Flight 77, struck the west face of the Pentagon in Virginia. At 10:03, a fourth airplane, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after a group of passengers attempted to regain control of the cockpit. Its original target, according to the subsequent investigation, was the Capitol, or the White House. In total, 2,977 people died that morning, not counting the 19 hijackers. The majority, 2,753, died in New York. Osama bin Laden had established his base of operations in Afghanistan in 1996, after being expelled from Sudan under American diplomatic pressure, and there he found protection from the Taliban regime, which had controlled most of the country since 1996 and shared with Al-Qaeda a rigorous interpretation of Islam, although both groups maintained different objectives and command structures. Bin Laden had already been identified as responsible for the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, which left 224 dead, and for the attack on the destroyer USS Cole in Yemen in the year 2000, which killed 17 sailors, leading the FBI to place him on its list of the 10 most wanted fugitives years before September 11th. Following the 1998 attacks, Bill Clinton's administration had launched cruise missile strikes against Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a chemical plant in Sudan, without succeeding in eliminating bin Laden, and on more than one occasion considered covert operations to capture or kill him, which ultimately were not carried out because of the CIA's own doubts about the accuracy of the available intelligence and the risk of civilian casualties. The Taliban government, led by Mullah Mohammed Omar, received repeated diplomatic requests from the United States and the United Nations to extradite bin Laden during the years before the attack, requests it systematically rejected by invoking tribal rules of hospitality towards someone it considered a guest. The original idea for the attack dates back to the mid-1990s, when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, then linked to jihadist networks in the Philippines, proposed to Osama bin Laden a plan to hijack multiple commercial airplanes and crash them into symbolic targets in the United States. The idea was directly related to an earlier plot, known as Operation Bojinka, discovered by the Philippine police in 1995, which had contemplated detonating bombs on several passenger airplanes simultaneously. Bin Laden approved a reduced version of the plan in 1998 or 1999 and appointed 4 pilots to lead the hijacking teams: Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian and the overall coordinator of the operation on American soil, Marwan al-Sheikhi, Ziad Jarrah, and Hani Hanjour. The 4 trained as pilots at civilian aviation schools in the United States between 2000 and 2001, paying in cash and raising little suspicion, since none of them requested specific training for takeoffs or landings, only for handling the aircraft in flight. The financing of the operation, estimated by the 9/11 Commission at about $400,000 to $500,000, reached the United States through fragmented bank transfers and cash deliveries, channeled in part by Mustafa al-Hawsawi, the group's financial logistics coordinator, and by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed himself from Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates. The Commission documented that, despite subsequent efforts to trace that money, the ultimate source of much of those funds was never established with certainty. The 19 hijackers arrived in the United States in different waves during 2000 and 2001 and were distributed in small groups in Florida, Virginia, New Jersey, and California, leading deliberately discreet lives. The CIA had identified 2 of them, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdar, as early as January 2000, after linking them to a meeting of Al-Qaeda operatives in Kuala Lumpur. But that information did not reach the FBI or immigration control databases until August 2001, only weeks before the attack, when it was already too late to locate them. The technical question that dominated the first months of the investigation was not whether the airplanes caused the collapses, but why 2 skyscrapers designed to withstand the impact of an airplane ended up collapsing in less than 2 hours. The Twin Towers had been designed in the 1960s with a structural system unusual for the time, known as a tube within a tube. A central core of steel columns supported the elevators and stairways, surrounded by an exterior facade formed by perimeter columns positioned very close together, joined by horizontal beams. Between both rings, concrete floors, supported by lightweight steel trusses, connected the entire structure and distributed the loads. The original engineers, including Leslie Robertson, had considered the scenario of an airplane impact during the design process, envisioning a Boeing 707, the largest commercial model available at the time. The calculations then assumed an airplane that had lost its way in fog, with its tanks almost empty after a long flight. No one modelled a deliberate attack with larger airplanes, full tanks and maximum speed. The impact of each airplane destroyed several perimeter columns and damaged part of the core, but that alone did not explain the collapse. The structure was designed to redistribute loads if some columns failed. The decisive factor was the fire. The airplane fuel did not burn for hours. It was consumed within a few minutes, but it ignited office materials that maintained temperatures of between 600 and 1000 degrees Celsius on the affected floors for a prolonged period. The structural steel did not melt. That is a point that generated a great deal of public confusion. But it lost a considerable part of its strength and rigidity at those temperatures, and it also expanded, deforming the beams and loosening their connections to the columns. In the South Tower, struck at a lower angle and across fewer floors, the collapse began at 9:59, 56 minutes after impact. In the North Tower, struck higher up but with more floors burning, the collapse came at 10:28, 102 minutes later. In both cases, the mechanism was similar. The beams weakened by the heat gave way, the upper floors fell onto the lower ones, and the accumulated weight exceeded the capacity of the remaining columns, generating a progressive collapse from top to bottom at a speed close to free fall. An additional factor, little known outside technical circles, was the design of the floors. Each level was supported by relatively lightweight steel trusses, optimized to reduce weight and construction cost, connected to the core and the exterior facade by bolted metal angles. That system, efficient under normal conditions, proved vulnerable to sustained heat. When the trusses expanded and then began to sag because of the steel's loss of rigidity, they pulled inward on the perimeter columns to which they were anchored, contributing to the visible bowing of the exterior facade in the minutes before the collapse of each tower, a phenomenon documented by news cameras and analyzed in detail in NIST's final 2005 report. That last fact, the speed of the collapse, fueled an alternative hypothesis for years: that the towers did not fall solely because of the fire, but because of explosive charges placed in advance, a controlled demolition. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, the federal agency responsible for the most exhaustive technical investigation, specifically analyzed this hypothesis. Its conclusions, published in 2005, ruled out the use of explosives. No traces of residues characteristic of explosive charges were found in the debris, nor were the high-magnitude seismic waves that a demolition on that scale would have produced recorded. And the collapse pattern, with visible asymmetric tilting and deformation before the fall, corresponded to a progressive structural failure caused by fire, not to a synchronized demolition. At 17:20 that same afternoon, 7 hours after the first impact, a third building in the complex collapsed. It was World Trade Center 7, a 47-story tower located half a block from the main towers, which was never struck by any airplane. The collapse of Building 7 became the most analyzed and most disputed chapter of the entire technical investigation of September 11th. Unlike the Twin Towers, whose fall was watched live by the entire world from the first impact, Building 7's collapse occurred without the same coverage from fixed cameras, and its cause was not evident to the naked eye. There was no hole caused by an airplane, only fires that burned for hours after debris from the North Tower fell onto its facade. The NIST investigation, published only in 2008, concluded that the collapse originated from a rare thermal failure. The fires, fueled by diesel fuel stored in the building for emergency generators, heated a steel beam on the 13th floor that supported a key column, column 79. That beam expanded because of the heat until it shifted out of its connection, causing the collapse of one floor, then another, and finally the failure of the entire column 79. That failure spread horizontally to the rest of the structure, generating what engineers call a total progressive collapse, something without documented precedent in a steel building before that day. This explanation did not end the debate. A group of architects and engineers organized in associations such as Architects and Engineers for 9/11, Truth, questioned the building's rate of descent for years. arguing that several seconds of the sequence showed acceleration close to free fall, something that according to them can only be explained if multiple support columns fail simultaneously, as in a planned demolition, and not sequentially as NIST maintains. NIST itself acknowledged, following public pressure, that there was a 2.25-second period of free fall in the building's north facade, a fact that did not appear with such clarity in preliminary versions of the report. The agency maintained that this period corresponded to the silent internal collapse of 8 floors before the exterior facade lost its support, not to a detonation. Building 7 housed offices of the CIA, the Secret Service, and the Department of Defense, as well as Securities and Exchange Commission files linked to ongoing financial investigations. None of those offices has been identified by concrete evidence as a motive for the collapse, but the combination of a building not struck by any airplane, high-profile intelligence occupants, and a technical report published 7 years after the event turned it into the central symbol of all doubts about the official account. A small group of academics, including physicist Stephen Jones, published independent studies between 2006 and 2009 in journals with low impact factors, claiming to have found particles in the World Trade Center dust compatible with thermite rich in aluminum and iron, a component that in theory could cut steel columns without generating the characteristic noise of a conventional explosive. The structural engineering community, including independent review panels convened by the American Society of Civil Engineers, questioned the methodology of those studies, pointing out that the discovery of microscopic metallic particles in the debris of a collapsed and burned building does not by itself constitute evidence of a demolition mechanism, and that no official forensic laboratory found signs of perforations or clean cuts in recovered columns, a trace that does remain in conventional controlled demolitions. In 2020, an investigation commissioned by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, funded by a group of architects skeptical of the official account, presented a computer model that concluded that fire alone was not sufficient to explain the symmetrical collapse of Building 7 and that the simultaneous failure of multiple internal columns was required. NIST responded publicly by rejecting that conclusion, maintaining that the university's model was based on thermal assumptions different from those recorded by the firefighters themselves at the site, and reaffirmed its original finding. The sequential failure of column 79, initiated by the thermal expansion of a single beam, remains the official explanation and the one most strongly supported by conventional forensic engineering to the present day. Coincidence or not, that same morning the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, had scheduled a military exercise called Vigilant Guardian, which simulated a large-scale aerial attack against the United States. That exercise, publicly revealed only during the Commission's investigation, created initial confusion among civilian and military air traffic controllers, who in the first minutes were unable to distinguish whether the alerts about airplanes out of control were part of the simulation or a real event. The American air defense system at the time had barely 14 fighter jets on permanent alert throughout the continental territory, a number inherited from the Cold War and intended to intercept Soviet bombers entering from the ocean, not commercial airplanes hijacked during domestic flights. When the Federal Aviation Administration notified the military command about Flight 11, several minutes had already passed since contact with the cockpit had been lost, and the protocols in force did not contemplate a scenario of an internal hijacking followed by a suicide attack. The first F-15 fighter jets took off from Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts at 8:53, 7 minutes after the first impact and too late to prevent it or to reach Flight 175 before its collision with the South Tower. By the time another pair of fighter jets took off from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia with the mission of intercepting a possible threat over Washington, Flight 77 was already heading toward the Pentagon and reached its destination before they did. Flight 93, the only one of the 4 that did not strike its target, crashed in Pennsylvania without military intervention after the passengers attempted to regain control of the cockpit upon learning, through telephone calls, what had happened in New York. The Commission concluded that no military fighter jet reached any of the 4 flights in time, and that the presidential order to shoot down hijacked civilian airplanes, given by Vice President Dick Cheney from a bunker beneath the White House, was transmitted to military pilots only after all 4 airplanes had already crashed. The impact against the Pentagon generated its own set of questions, fueled in part by the initial scarcity of public images of the exact moment of the collision. During the first few years, only a few frames from a security camera at the building circulated, released by the FBI in 2006, giving rise to theories claiming that the impact had not been caused by a commercial airplane, but by a missile. The official investigation, supported by radar records, Flight 77's black box, engine remains identified by their serial numbers as belonging to a Boeing 757, and more than 100 eyewitnesses on nearby highways established that the airplane did strike the building. The relatively contained damage compared with the magnitude of the collision in New York was explained by the low angle of approach and by the fact that the Pentagon had been structurally reinforced a few years earlier in a section that withstood the impact better than the rest of the building. What was documented and generated legitimate scrutiny was the slowness of the Air Force's response. The interceptor fighter jets took longer than expected to take off, partly because North America's air defense system, designed during the Cold War, was oriented toward detecting threats coming from outside American territory, not commercial airplanes hijacked from within the country's own airspace. This failure of doctrine, rather than technology, was acknowledged in the 9/11 Commission's final report. Flight 93 took off from Newark 41 minutes behind its original schedule, a fact that proved decisive because by the time the 4 hijackers took control of the cockpit at 9:28, several passengers had already received information by satellite and cellular telephone about the attacks against the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. At least 13 passengers and crew members made calls from the airplane, including Todd Beamer, whose conversation with a telephone operator from the Verizon company was recorded and revealed that a group of passengers was planning to attempt to retake control of the aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder, recovered from the impact site, recorded the sounds of that attempt at around 9:57, screams, the struggle against the cockpit door, and finally the hijackers' decision to crash the airplane before losing total control in an open field near Shanksville, about 20 minutes by air from Washington. The 9/11 Commission concluded, based on internal Al-Qaeda documents later found in Afghanistan and on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's own testimony during his detention, that the most likely target of that 4th airplane was the Capitol, the seat of the United States Congress, although it did not completely rule out the White House as an alternative. Despite the magnitude of the collapse, the vast majority of the people who were inside the towers at the time of impact managed to escape alive. It is estimated that about 16,400 people were in the complex that morning, and more than 87 out of every 100 were able to evacuate before the collapses. In the South Tower, where the impact was lower, many employees on floors above the point of impact began descending the stairs as soon as the first impact occurred in the neighboring tower. A decision that saved hundreds of lives despite internal announcements that initially asked people to remain at their workstations. The New York City Fire Department lost 343 members that day, the largest number of casualties in the department's history, in a single incident, most of them while entering the towers to assist with the evacuation while they were still standing. The New York City Police Department and the Port Authority lost 23 and 37 officers respectively. Several of the firefighters who died were on intermediate floors helping people with reduced mobility descend, without enough time to retreat when the collapse began. On the floors above the impacts, between 1,300 and 1,400 people were trapped with no possibility of descending, since smoke and fire blocked the only stairways available in each tower. About 200 of those people, trapped by the heat and smoke, fell or jumped from the upper floors in the minutes before the collapse, a phenomenon that television networks generally decided not to show live. The United States government took 14 months to create an independent commission to investigate the attacks, and did so only after intense pressure from victims' relatives, organized in groups such as Families of September 11th and the so-called Jersey Girls, 4 widows from New Jersey who became a decisive factor in overcoming the White House's initial resistance to the creation of an independent panel. The initial budget assigned to the commission, $3 million, proved so limited for the magnitude of the task that its own chairman had to request an increase in funding from Congress halfway through the investigation, which was ultimately raised to $15 million. The 9/11 Commission, composed of 5 Democratic and 5 Republican members, worked for 20 months, interviewed more than 1,200 people in 10 countries, and reviewed 2.5 million pages of documents. Its final report, published in July 2004, reconstructed in detail the planning by Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who, according to the report itself, conceived the original idea for the attack as early as 1996. It also documented serious coordination failures between the CIA and the FBI, which had identified 2 of the future hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdar, months before the attacks without sharing that information between the 2 agencies in time. The Commission's own chairman, Thomas Keane, and its vice chairman, Lee Hamilton, publicly stated after publication that they had faced obstruction from intelligence agencies during the investigation, and that the Pentagon had provided testimony that later proved inaccurate regarding the timeline of the military response that morning. In their jointly authored book published in 2006, both went so far as to state that they considered recommending a criminal investigation for perjury against Department of Defense officials, something that ultimately did not proceed. Hours after the attacks, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization invoked for the first and only time in its history Article 5 of its founding charter, the Collective Defense Clause establishing that an attack against one member is an attack against all, activated in favor of the United States, despite the fact that the attack did not come from a member state. The United Nations, for its part, unanimously approved a resolution the following day condemning the attack and recognizing the United States' right to self-defense, support that the Bush administration would later use as a basis for justifying the invasion of Afghanistan. Within the United States, civil aviation was completely halted for the first time in the country's history. All airspace was closed for nearly 3 days, leaving hundreds of international flights diverted to airports in Canada, and New York's financial markets remained closed for 4 consecutive sessions, the longest interruption of the New York Stock Exchange since the Great Depression. In the area of aviation security, Congress created the Transportation Security Administration in November 2001, replacing private passenger screening companies with federal personnel at all airports in the country. Airlines reinforced cockpit doors with armor resistant to bullet impacts and manual forced entry, a measure that until then had not been mandatory, and passenger access to the cockpit during flight was prohibited under any circumstances. A protocol change directly derived from how the hijackers had managed to enter the cockpits of the 4 airplanes with simple cutting instruments. 1 month before the attacks, FBI agents in Minneapolis detained Zacharias Moussoui, a French citizen of Moroccan origin, after instructors at a local flight school reported his unusual interest in learning how to maneuver a Boeing 747 without requiring training in takeoffs or landings. The local agent handling the case, Harry Samit, requested a court order to examine Moussoui's personal computer, convinced that he might be planning an airplane hijacking. But FBI headquarters in Washington repeatedly rejected the request because it considered that the available evidence did not meet the required legal standard. After the attacks, Moussoui's computer was finally examined and revealed information related to commercial flights and to some of the contact details used by the hijackers, leading him to be publicly labeled the 20th hijacker. Although prosecutors were never able to prove with certainty whether he was part of the original September 11th plan or of a parallel attack that was never carried out. Moussoui was sentenced in 2006 to life imprisonment without parole, following a trial in which he gave contradictory testimony at different hearings, claiming both his participation in and his disconnection from the plan. A joint congressional report from 2002 documented at least 11 other intelligence warnings received by American agencies between 1998 and 2001 that mentioned, with varying degrees of precision, the possibility that Al-Qaeda might use commercial airplanes as weapons. Among them was an internal CIA memorandum dated August 6, 2001, entitled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S., personally delivered to President Bush at his residence in Texas. which mentioned in general terms the possibility of airplane hijackings without providing a specific target, date, or method. That document, declassified only in 2004 under pressure from the Commission itself, became one of the most frequently cited symbols of the disconnect between the available intelligence and the government's actual prevention capabilities. Television coverage of the second impact, broadcast live by practically every network in the world, turned the attack into one of the most widely watched events in real time in the history of television up to that point, with audience estimates exceeding 2 billion cumulative viewers throughout the day in different countries. Newspapers and news programs in dozens of countries suspended their regular programming for days to provide uninterrupted coverage of the consequences of the attack, something that until then had occurred on a different scale, only with the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. Governments across the political spectrum formally expressed condolences, including countries with historically tense relations with Washington. Iran, then governed by reformist President Mohammad Khatami, condemned the attack and organized public vigils in Tehran, a gesture that contrasted with the country's later inclusion in American foreign policy discourse as part of an axis of evil barely 4 months later. In the Gaza Strip and some minority sectors of other Arab countries, by contrast, images of isolated celebrations circulated and were amplified by the major Western networks, generating subsequent controversy over how representative those scenes were of general sentiment in the region, where most governments and social organizations explicitly condemned the attack. The chapter most frequently cited as evidence of a real rather than speculative cover-up is that of the so-called 28 pages. It is an entire section of the 2002 Joint Congressional Report preceding the Commission's report that was classified as secret by the George W. Bush administration and kept hidden for 13 years. Those pages contained preliminary findings by congressional investigators regarding possible financial links between some of the hijackers, particularly 2 of those who lived in San Diego, and Saudi citizens with connections to the government of Saudi Arabia, including a former official from the Saudi embassy in Washington. The content did not prove official participation by the Saudi government in the attacks, and the 9/11 Commission itself later clarified this in its public report, but it documented financial leads that, according to the congressional investigators themselves, were never fully resolved. Relatives of victims and several legislators, including Democratic Senator Bob Graham, who had chaired the original investigation, demanded the declassification of those pages for more than a decade. They were finally made public in July 2016, with some portions still redacted. That same demand led to a lawsuit by relatives of victims against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, filed in a federal court in New York under a 2016 law that allows foreign states to be sued for acts of terrorism on American soil. The case progressed slowly for years, until in 2021, a group of nearly 1,800 relatives formally asked then-President Joe Biden to order the complete declassification of the files from an FBI investigation known internally as Operation Encore, focused on the logistical support network that 2 of the hijackers received in San Diego. Biden signed an executive order that same year to review and progressively release those documents, one of which, published in 2021, identified a former Saudi embassy official, Omar al-Bayoumi, under the internal designation Subject 257, as a person whom the FBI at one point considered a possible Saudi intelligence agent who provided logistical assistance to the hijackers without there being conclusive proof that he acted under official instructions from his government. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has denied in every judicial proceeding any institutional connection to the attacks, and the litigation remains open before American courts. Alongside these documented points of genuine opacity, theories circulated in parallel that technical and forensic evidence ultimately ruled out over the years. The thermite hypothesis, which maintained that an incendiary compound had been used to cut the steel columns, was based on the discovery of small metallic spheres in the debris dust. Subsequent studies by independent geologists and metallurgists from the universities that promoted the original theory identified that this type of sphere is a common and expected byproduct of any large-scale fire in a steel structure, not evidence of explosives. The theory that no airplane struck the Pentagon was ruled out by the accumulation of physical evidence. Engine remains documented with serial numbers, passenger DNA identified at the site, and radar records cross-checked with those from the recovered black box. The claim that financial operators had obtained extraordinary profits by betting in advance on the decline of American Airlines and United Airlines shares through put options also circulated for years, suggesting prior knowledge of the attack. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI specifically investigated those transactions, identifying in particular an unusual volume of purchases of put options on both airlines recorded in the days before September 11th. Subsequent analysis determined that the vast majority of those transactions corresponded to a single American institutional investor with no connection to the attacks, who had taken that position for portfolio strategy reasons unrelated to the attack, and to other funds that routinely traded that type of instrument in the airline sector. Even so, the 9/11 Commission's own report acknowledged in a footnote that a small number of transactions could not be linked with complete certainty to an identified final buyer, a detail that has since fueled unproven speculation about prior knowledge of the attack in some financial circles. 6 months after the attacks, in March 2002, the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service generated intense public controversy by automatically processing and approving changes in immigration status for 2 of the hijackers, Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi, posthumously authorizing their enrollment in a flight school in Florida. The process had been initiated before September 11th, and the system, which was entirely paper-based at the time, had no way to automatically cross-check applicants' names against lists of deceased or wanted persons, resulting in the public issuance, weeks after the attack, of student visa approvals in the names of 2 of those responsible for the attack. The episode accelerated the merger of immigration agencies within the new Department of Homeland Security and the digitization of the immigration control system. The attacks immediately transformed the foreign and security policy of the United States. 1 month later, the country invaded Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban regime that had given refuge to bin Laden, beginning the longest armed conflict in American history, which lasted 20 years, until the withdrawal in 2021. In 2003, the Bush administration invaded Iraq on the grounds that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction, an argument that subsequent investigations, including the 2005 Rob Silberman Commission itself, determined had been based on faulty intelligence. No weapons of mass destruction were found in the country after the invasion, and Hussein himself had, as the CIA-formed Iraq survey group later concluded, no operational connection whatsoever to Al-Qaeda or to the planning of September 11th, despite surveys at the time showing that a considerable portion of the American population believed otherwise. A Brown University study, published in various updates between 2018 and 2021 under the name Costs of War Project, estimated that the combined military operations arising from September 11th in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and other regions cost the American Treasury more than $8 trillion over 2 decades, including direct military spending, medical care for veterans, and associated debt interest. The same study calculated that the total number of direct deaths linked to these conflicts, including combatants from all sides and civilians, exceeded 900,000 people, with Iraq and Afghanistan accounting for the vast majority of those victims. Within the country, Congress passed the Patriot Act in October 2001, significantly expanding the government's surveillance powers over private communications, and in 2002 the Department of Homeland Security was created, the largest reorganization of the federal government since World War II. Documents leaked by former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden in 2013 revealed that part of that surveillance architecture had developed into programs for the mass collection of American citizens' telephone and internet data, far beyond the original scope that had been presented to the public after the attacks. The search for Osama bin Laden lasted almost 10 years, until a United States Navy Special Operations team located and killed him in a residential compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, on May 2, 2011, in an operation authorized by President Barack Obama and followed in real time from the White House. His body was thrown into the sea hours later from an aircraft carrier, a decision that the American government justified on religious grounds and to prevent his grave from becoming a pilgrimage site, although it also generated its own trail of doubts, since no independent public photographic record of the body exists. In parallel, the American government established a detention center in 2002 at the naval base in Guantanamo, Cuba, to hold terrorism suspects captured outside its territory without subjecting them to the ordinary civilian judicial system. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, captured in Pakistan in 2003, has remained detained there ever since, and his military trial for the September 11th attacks continues more than 2 decades later without a definitive start date, delayed largely by legal disputes over the admissibility of confessions obtained through interrogation techniques that a 2014 Senate report described as torture, including the repeated use of simulated drowning. In the area of health, thousands of first responders, police officers, firefighters, and rescue workers who spent weeks at Ground Zero developed chronic respiratory diseases and various types of cancer over the years, linked to prolonged exposure to the toxic dust generated by the collapse, which contained asbestos, lead, dioxins, and pulverized glass. The administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency at the time, Christine Todd Whitman, publicly declared a few days after the attacks that the air in the area was safe to breathe, a statement that a subsequent report by that same agency's Inspector General, published in 2003, determined did not have sufficient scientific support when it was issued, given the limited number of samples analyzed up to that point. Congress created the James Zadroga Health Fund in 2011, named in honor of a police officer who died from a lung disease linked to his work at Ground Zero, expanded and renewed in subsequent years to cover long-term medical treatments. By the middle of the 2020s, the World Trade Center Health Program, administered by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, had enrolled more than 130,000 people for conditions related to exposure to the dust from the attack, including more than 70 different types of cancer officially recognized as linked to that exposure. And the number of deaths from these diseases among first responders exceeded, according to estimates by various rescue veterans organizations, the number of firefighters and police officers who died on the day of the attacks itself. NIST's technical investigation was not limited to explaining what happened. It also generated 40 specific recommendations for the design of future skyscrapers, progressively incorporated into the International Building Code between 2007 and 2015. Among the most significant changes, an increase was required in the fire resistance of the insulating coating on steel columns, which in the original Twin Towers had deteriorated or partially detached because of the impact of the airplanes before the fire began, leaving the metal exposed to temperatures higher than those anticipated in the original design. The minimum standards for the width and number of evacuation stairways in skyscrapers were also revised, a problem demonstrated on the day of the attack itself, when thousands of people had to descend through narrow stairways shared between floors, creating bottlenecks. The requirement to install specific stairways intended exclusively for firefighters in high-rise buildings was also incorporated, and internal communication protocols were revised, since in 2001 much of the towers depended on loudspeaker announcements that, in some cases, transmitted outdated or contradictory instructions while the situation evolved minute by minute. The cleanup of the site, known for months as Ground Zero, continued until May 2002, and removed nearly 1.8 million tons of debris, most of it transported to the Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island, where forensic teams continued examining material in search of human remains for several more years. The process of identifying victims through DNA, one of the largest forensic efforts in the history of the United States, made it possible to confirm the identities of around 60% of the victims during the first decade. a percentage that slowly increased thanks to advances in genetic sequencing techniques. The reconstruction of the site became a long and disputed process involving the Port Authority, the New York government, and the complex's private leaseholder, Larry Silverstein, who had signed the lease agreement for the towers only 6 weeks before the attacks and entered into years of litigation with insurers to determine whether the attack should be counted as one or two separate events for insurance payment purposes. The final design of the new main building, known as One World Trade Center or Freedom Tower by architect David Childs, was inaugurated in November 2014, with a symbolic height of 1,776 feet in reference to the year of American independence. The site's memorial and museum, with 2 reflecting pools located exactly on the footprints of the original towers, opened in 2011 and 2014, respectively. Of the 2,753 victims recorded in New York, the city's Office of Chief Medical Examiner recovered more than 22,000 bone and tissue fragments in the months after the collapse, many of them extremely small because of the force of the collapse and the high temperatures sustained for weeks in the debris, which continued burning underground until December 2001. The identification process through DNA comparison with samples provided by relatives began immediately but progressed unevenly. While some victims were identified within weeks, thousands of fragments remained unassigned for years. The medical examiner's office periodically resumes the process as genetic sequencing technology improves, making it possible to extract usable profiles from samples increasingly degraded by heat and time. By 2023, more than 20 years after the attack, the number of identified victims had exceeded 60% of the total, and the office continued making new identifications every year, the most recent confirmed in 2024, corresponding to a man whose family requested that his name remain confidential. Around 1,100 victims remain, to the present day, without any identified fragment. More than 2 decades after the attacks, certain elements of the investigation remain without complete resolution. Thousands of pages of FBI files linked to the case, including Operation Encore records concerning the support network in San Diego, remain under declassification review by court order and are released partially and progressively every certain number of years. The civil lawsuit by relatives of the victims against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia continues in federal courts in New York, in one of the most extensive terrorism liability cases ever litigated in the American judicial system. The military trial against Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 other co-defendants at the Guantanamo base continues, 2 decades after their capture, without a defined start date, trapped in legal disputes over the validity of evidence obtained under interrogations that the American government itself acknowledged as coercive. In 2024, a plea agreement negotiated between military prosecutors and the defendants' lawyers, which would have avoided the death penalty in exchange for an agreed sentence, was annulled by then-Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, leaving the case once again unresolved and without clear prospects of reaching trial in the near term. Meanwhile, at the site where the towers once stood, 2 pools of water continue falling into a square void, bordered by the names of each of the 2,977 people who died that morning, engraved in bronze according to a proximity criterion that groups together those who worked together, traveled on the same flight, or responded together to the same emergency call.